Oh, what's up everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, I'm going to show you how to set up Visual Studio Code to do Salesforce development to make your life much easier as a Salesforce developer. All right, everybody. So before we get into actually setting up Visual Studio Code for Salesforce development, let me just briefly explain why you would ever want to do this. I think to most people who are watching this video, you probably know, but an IDE stands for an integrated development environment, and basically what it allows you to do is your job much easier and faster as a developer. So, for instance, up here you can see that I have a new case object that I'm adding. I've just added the hi there subject line, but say I wanted to add more to new case, I can just do that, put a dot operator there, and then you can see that it's going to present to me all the different fields available on the case object. So I don't have to go back to the actual object in Salesforce to remind myself of the various fields that I have. They're all just right here in the IDE for me to go through and determine which one I actually want to update. On top of that, there are other things too. So for instance, if I wanted to do call a method on the system class, I can type system, put the dot operator, if I can talk, and there it pops up all the methods available in the system class for me to leverage, and that just makes it a whole lot easier as a developer to kind of see what is available to you and to leverage those things easily, right? And on top of that, there's so many different reasons why you would want to use an IDE, especially when you consider all of the various extensions and plugins for both the Salesforce CLI and for Visual Studio Code in general. So you can see right here, I've got different colorized brackets here to allow me to easily see which bracket pairs belong to each other. Makes my life a little easier. And you can also see that right here, I've got these messages that pop up when I go over these lines. And there's a extension called GitLens, I think, that allows me to see my commit messages for my code. So especially if you're working in a repository, that extension makes your life a bit easier, as long as people are putting useful commit messages, which obviously this one here isn't. But I just wanted to demonstrate it for this video. So long story short, makes your life a lot easier. It's in your best interest to leverage an IDE in general, and Visual Studio Code is the one that Salesforce itself actually maintains the extensions for, and so you can probably expect it to be updated the most often with the most up-to-date functionality for Salesforce. All right, let's get into, now that I have explained that for a couple minutes, how to actually install this. So the first thing you'll want to install is the Salesforce CLI. I'll have this link in the description of the video, but you'll just install this, and then you'll have the basically all the command line interface commands for Salesforce, which is great because there are a ton of extremely useful things you can do with them. And you will definitely, you have to have it for Visual Studio Code to function the way that you want it to function. So after you have downloaded the Salesforce CLI, you'll then want to download Visual Studio Code. And please make sure to actually download Visual Studio Code and not just Visual Studio. They are two different things, and the plugins for Salesforce only exist in Visual Studio Code. The last thing is completely optional. You don't necessarily have to download this, but you can download Node.js and NPM, and I only suggest this because there are a great deal of useful NPM or useful things available in NPM for Salesforce Development. Again, this part is optional. You can download Node.js and NPM if you want, or not. You don't have to, but it will come in handy eventually, I promise. Okay, so once we have that all set up and we've downloaded all those things, you will open up Visual Studio Code, and in Visual Studio Code over here on the left side of the screen you'll see the extensions icon, and if you click that, you'll want to search for the Salesforce extension pack. And the Salesforce extension pack basically houses a whole bunch of different extensions that Salesforce has made for Visual Studio Code that can technically work on their own, but are nowhere near as useful individually as they are together. So it's in your best interest to install this pack, not just these individual extensions. So you're going to search for this, find it, and right here it would say install instead of uninstall if I hadn't already installed it. And then once it's done installing, we've got a couple of things to do. So after it's done installing, basically what we'll do is we'll hit Control-Shift-P, and this is the hotkey for the command palette, which is not just used, it's used for virtually every plugin that you would ever put into Visual Studio Code. So just remember that Control-Shift-P to bring up the command palette, because you will be using it all of the time. And I am going to show you how to set this up with an org-based model. So I'm going to show you how to set up a SFDX project with an org-based model. And what that means is your source of truth is still your production your source of truth is still your production instance. It's not in a repository. So the setup between the two is not a whole lot different, but there's a couple extra steps with the org-based model that are important to know. And I should just say, if you can make your way away from the org-based model and into a repository-based model, it is a lot better after you get used to it. But I know that most people aren't there yet, so I'm going to show you, at least in this first video, how to set up a Visual Studio Code project using an org-based model, just because I feel like most people are still in that mindset. In a future video, I'll show you how to do it with a repository and SFDX and all that kind of wonderful stuff that makes development even better. But today, it's an org-based model. All right. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is connect to whatever org it is that you are interested in, your sandbox org, maybe, hopefully not your production org, a developer org, whatever. So the first thing we're going to do is do SFDX create project with manifest. Technically, you don't necessarily have to do this, but I'm going to show you why building a project with a manifest for an org-based setup where you're actually connecting directly to an org instead of to like a GitHub repository is beneficial. So I'm going to create this project with a manifest. I'm going to create it with a standard template. Basically what the standard manifest template is it allows you to automatically, it creates a manifest file that pulls in all Apex classes, Visual Force pages, Lightning Web Components, Aura components, basically all your code. An empty one would just create an empty one that doesn't, have any XML preset up to pull in anything, and an analytics one is set up for analytics, which most people aren't going to use. So I'm not going to go over it for the moment. Okay, and then you'll put in whatever project name you want. So I'm going to call this Giotto Demo, because the name of my namespace in my org is Giotto. And you basically are just going to pick a folder wherever you want on your desktop or within your, on your computer that works for you. So I've already got that set up. And ooh, this won't pop up, but I was just showing you guys that case creator thing. I'm just going to hit not save, or don't save. Okay, and once you've done that, once you've created a new project through that command line palette, you'll see over here on the left side that it automatically pulled in a bunch of useful stuff you won't that you'll use throughout your project. So the first thing that we're going to do before we get any further is we're going to go to this SFDX project JSON. Now, you don't actually have to do this part, but it will make your life a little easier when you're creating these projects, especially for people who are using my domains that you actually have to use your my domain to log in, and you can't just use login or test.salesforce.com. You'll come in here to your SFDX project JSON and go to your SFDC login URL and change it to whatever your my domain is. That'll be useful here in a second, and you'll see why. And if you're using this, hopefully, for the most part, to connect to sandbox orgs, you can also set this up to just be test.salesforce.com. I'm going to set it back because I actually have a developer instance, the free developer instance that I'm connecting to, so I'm going to leave it at login. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do here after we've updated this URL in our SFDX project JSON is we're going to go Control Shift P to bring up the command palette again, and we are going to do SFDX authorize an org. And basically what this is going to do is allow us to log in and authorize ourselves in our org that we're trying to connect to pull information from or pull metadata from. So we'll do that, and as long as you actually updated that login URL, use the project default. Otherwise, you can choose from one of these three things: production, which is login.salesforce.com, sandbox is test.salesforce.com, or you can enter your my domain custom one if you want. And then it's going to ask you to create an alias for your org. This is just an easy way to reference your org in the future. And I'm just going to call this what I named it before, which is Giotto Demo. And this is going to run a command that you'll see pop up in the bottom right corner. I know that my face is kind of interfering with that, but it's going to pull up a window that looks like this. So it just automatically popped this window. It was on my other screen, so I brought it over here, and it's going to allow you to log in through your browser into your org. So once you log in through your browser into your org that you're interested in, then you'll see down here that it ran successfully, and let me see here. It didn't pop it up. There'll be a little thing in the bottom right corner that lets you know that you connected successfully after you logged in. And again, unfortunately, it popped up on my other screen, but once you run that authorize an org command, it's going to automatically pop up a window in whatever your default browser is for your computer that allows you to log into Salesforce. And that's the window that I pulled over and just logged in with. So anyway, now that we've logged in, you can verify that you've successfully logged in by going over here to the org browser, waiting for it to load for a minute, and seeing that it definitely logged in because you've got all of this available metadata to pull. So if I wanted to drop this down, the Apex classes, I can see all of the Apex classes in my org. And I can just click the Retrieve Source from Org button over here on the Apex classes to pull all of these Apex classes into my local Visual Studio Code project. So right now, we're in this thing called the org browser, which is very convenient. Basically, it lets you observe all of the metadata within your Salesforce org that you've connected to, and it allows you to pull that metadata, whichever metadata types you want, into your project over here. So right now, if I looked at my classes in my project, there's nothing here. But if I go to my org browser after connecting to my Salesforce instance, and I click the Retrieve Source from Org button, it's going to download all of those classes. So you can see right here, it's got the force source retrieve command that it's run, and it's looking for all of the Apex classes. And as soon as that command is done running, then over here you can see all of our classes got loaded into our project, which is great. So that means that we can go into one of these classes and start making updates to it. Wonderful. There is there's a couple other things that you'll need to do. Well, you don't actually have to do them, but it's in your best interest to do them, at least in my opinion, in most setups. So if you didn't know, say I wanted to update this, and I said cs dot, whatever, I'm looking for another field. You can see that the fields aren't auto-completing yet, unfortunately. The fields, even after you bring in or connect your project to your org, won't autocomplete until you run one more command in Visual Studio Code, and that command is refresh something, sfdx refresh SObject. There it is, refresh SObject definitions. And the first time you do this, you'll want to do all SObjects, so that'll pull in both your custom SObjects and your standard ones. But in the future, you might only need to update your custom ones or your standard ones based on whatever you're doing in your org. So you'll run that, and basically what it's going to do is create these files that it can reference to that represent your objects in your org, so that it can, basically it can intelligently autocomplete the field names for everything. I don't want to get too deep into the technical explanation of what those are because it's not necessarily important, but basically this command creates SObject definition files within your local project here in Visual Studio Code so that you can do auto-completion of fields and whatnot. So this actually, this command might take me a while. Okay, actually, there we go, it's good. In bigger orgs, that command might take a little while. So I was considering cutting the video and waiting, but I ran a little quicker than I'm used to. So if we do cs.now, you can see that for this case that I was trying to do auto-completion for before, and it didn't have any fields pop up, now all of those fields pop up, which is super useful, right? So now I can, update the case comments, and I don't have to remember the name of that field if I don't want to. Okay, and the next thing that I want to show you is that, you might be used to, if you're still working in the developer console, or maybe if you're working in Illuminated Cloud, because it's borderline set up almost by default in Illuminated Cloud in IntelliJ, the save on, basically deploying this source to your org on a Control-S or save command. By default, Visual Studio Code won't do this. You actually have to right-click on your class here and do deploy source to org to get it to actually save down to your actual org that you've connected to. If you don't want to have to deal with that, you can go to File, Preferences, Settings. In the Settings area, click on Extensions. Scroll all the way down to Salesforce Feature Previews, and then if we scroll down a little bit more here, there is a deploy or push or deploy on save, and you can enable this. So by default, this is actually unchecked. For me, I've updated this so that it will automatically do this. And so basically, after you check this, if you hit Control-S to save, it's going to automatically push your code updates into whatever org you're connected to. So it can be pretty beneficial. That being said, you do need to be careful. Some setups, this might not be the best idea, but I think in the majority of situations it makes your life a little bit easier. Another thing that is super beneficial, especially if you have that Control S or that auto deploy on save checked, is this somewhat new detect conflicts at sync setting here. So basically, if you're this is really only beneficial if you are deploying to an org instead of a repository, because, well, I'm not going to get into that. Repos have a whole different model where you should hopefully be doing pull requests and merging and finding those conflicts that way. But if you're just saving directly to an org and you want to make sure that you're not going to conflict, your save isn't going to conflict with some work that some other developer did, or you know, maybe you somehow made updates in the dev console or something in your org, and you forgot to bring them back into Visual Studio Code, and you're about to save over them. Well, if you check this box, so this is normally unchecked as well. If you check this box and you hit Control S and there's actually a conflict, it's going to go and inform you that you're about to make a save that is going to override some work that you may not be aware of. So maybe you should review it first. So it'll do that, and it'll actually allow you to review it within Visual Studio Code itself. It's super nice. I would definitely suggest enabling this feature. If no, just in general, you should do it. And there's one other beneficial setting here that is not enabled by default. So there is in the Salesforce Apex configuration in these settings a checkbox that says enable SObject refresh on startup. So if we just a minute ago ran this Control-Shift-P refresh SObject definitions command, you would really want to run that every single time you started up your project to make sure that you brought in any relevant updates to SObjects within your org. Maybe another developer had updated some fields or something along those lines. To avoid having to run that command every single time, you can actually just come in here, and this is unchecked by default, but if you check this box, every time you start up your Visual Studio Code project, it's going to go in and do those SObject refreshes for you. So in that way, your project is always up to date with your SObject definition, so your autocomplete always stays up to date for you. Super nice. Okay, so that is all of the settings and the setup that is relevant. I'm going to show you one other way through the manifest files to pull in metadata from your org. So if you don't want to have to come in here and click every individual download button in the org browser to pull in metadata from your org, which can be super time consuming depending on what you're doing, you can actually use the manifest file, which we kind of talked about briefly when we set up this project. But whenever we did that create a project with a manifest file, basically what it did is it created this manifest folder here with a package.xml file. And that package.xml file looks a lot like a package.xml file you would use for Ant scripts or something along those lines if you're familiar with those. Basically what you have in here is your metadata type and the members or the names of the metadata type that you would want to pull in. So if you have a star here, it just means pull in all the metadata of this metadata type, or all the different files relevant to that metadata type. So for instance, if we just wanted to pull in the case trigger handler class, instead of a star, you would type in case trigger handler class. Or just actually it would just be case trigger handler, I believe. And then it would pull that information in for you, but it wouldn't pull in everything. It would just pull in the case trigger handler. And this might be kind of confusing if you've never dealt with this before. I will have a link in the description that kind of goes over how to set up manifest files and stuff like that. And there's actually a plugin that helps you automatically create these manifest files if you wanted to. for Visual Studio Code, and I'll link that in the description as well. But let me just briefly go over how you would how you would pull your metadata from your org using a manifest file, and why you might want to do it this way. You might want to do it this way because it will save you time in the long run. Say if you're pulling in the same things consistently for a lot of different projects, instead of having to go for every single project to the org browser and clicking that download button for everything, you could just set up a manifest file that you use in all of your projects and download things based on the manifest file. And let me show you how much easier that is. So for instance, I've got, basically in this manifest file, I would be pulling in all of my Apex classes, Visual Force components, Visual Force pages, test suites, triggers, Aura bundles, Lightning Web Components, and static resources. And if I want to just pull that in from the manifest file instead of clicking a bunch of different things in the org browser, I would go Command-Shift-P, SFDX, retrieve source and manifest from org. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to look to our manifest file to retrieve all the metadata that we want from our actual organization. And once I click that command and run it, you can see it started a job that is in progress. And this might take a while, especially depending on how much you're attempting to pull in. This, for me, is probably going to take a couple minutes, so unless it surprises me, I'm probably going to cut this and come back, because I don't want to waste your time for 2 full minutes watching me. So I'll go ahead and do that now, and I'll be right back. Alright, so it took, maybe a minute after I stopped the video to finish pulling in all of the metadata from the org that I had asked it to from this manifest file definition. But as you can see, with just a single command, I've been able to bring in all of my Aura components, not applications, I don't have any in this org, my Visual Force components, Lightning Web Components, Visual Force pages, static resources, and triggers. So a lot of things were brought in with me just simply running that one command and setting up this package.xml file. And that happened in, the course of a minute or two. Whereas if I had gone to the org browser and clicked this button a whole bunch of times, it would have taken a lot longer. Especially if you only wanted to bring in specific Apex classes or specific Visual Force pages or something. So again, using the manifest file is not required, but it can make your life a little easier depending on, what exactly you need to bring in to do the work you want to do in your Visual Studio Code project. Okay, guys, I think that's probably it for today. Hopefully this has helped somebody out there make their life a little easier when setting up Visual Studio Code. If you want an even more condensed version of this, please check out the blog post. It'll have all the commands in order, what they do, all that kind of stuff. So you can just reference it forever and ever for your projects if you want to. If you liked this video, please make sure to subscribe. I try to do at least one a week. And yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you next time.